Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG's Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone.
Now, this edition is a special podcast looking back over day 2 of our governance conference, which took place on Friday the 18th of November online. As you would expect, a range of interesting topical subjects were included in the programme, and we thought that we might pick a few items from the day for this week's podcast, which illustrate the quality of the content available. And so you don't miss out on key headline news, we've also included coverage of the much-awaited government autumn financial statement too, which was made last Thursday. Whilst Dennis and I are highlighting a few of the sessions, there isn't time to go through all of them. Delegates will receive a copy of all sessions shortly. If you weren't booked on and want to obtain copies, please do get in touch and we can work out a package for you. But first, Dennis, you've been following the impact of last week's autumn statement from the government. What does this mean for local government?
Well, Helen, yes, there's been major concern about what the autumn statement might involve. Local authorities have warned in the weeks running up to Jeremy Hunt's statement that they face an existential crisis caused by massive funding shortfalls. So here are the key headlines in my summary. Increases in adult social care and education budgets were prominent among the main headline announcements made in the autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt has said that the government will spend an extra $7.5 billion on adult social care services over the next 2 years. More broadly, Hunt claimed that his plans for the economy would see funding for public services continue to rise over the next 5 years, but said that government departments will have to make efficiencies to deal with inflationary pressures in the next 2 years. Now, back to the additional funding for adult social care. The Chancellor said that he had heard extensive representations about the challenges faced by our sector. He noted the massive pressure on adult care services in particular, and added that he had heard very real concerns from local authorities, particularly about their ability to immediately implement the DILNOT reforms, which would introduce a new payment cap on care costs. Hunt has chosen to delay those reforms and provide immediate funding for more care packages to reduce the pressure upon NHS capacity. The government will allocate a further funding of £1 billion next year and £1.7 billion the year after to address this particular issue. Combined with savings from the delayed DILNOT reforms and more council tax flexibilities, this means an increase in funding for the social care sector of up to £2.8 billion in 2023 and £4.7 billion in 2024, Hunt said. On schools and the core schools budget, the government has decided to increase the core schools budget by £2.3 billion in 2023-24 and a further £2.3 billion in 2024-25. New council tax flexibilities have also been introduced. The government is giving local authorities in England additional flexibility in setting council tax by increasing the referendum limit for increases in council tax to 3% per year from April 2023. In addition, local authorities with social care responsibilities will be able to increase the adult social care precept by up to 2% per year. And in other announcements, Hunt confirmed that £1.7 billion from the Levelling Up Fund would be allocated before the end of the year. The government will also press ahead with major infrastructure projects, including HS2 to Manchester, the Northern Powerhouse Rail Core Network, and East West Rail. And the controversial Sizewell B nuclear plant is also to go ahead. In addition, the Chancellor reaffirmed the government's commitment to devolution, stating that he wished to make it easier for local leaders to make things happen without banging on a Whitehall door, he said. He said that soon, over half of England would be covered by devolution deals, following trailblazer deals in Manchester and the West Midlands. A new mayor is to be elected in Suffolk as part of a deal agreed with Suffolk County Council, while the government is in advanced discussions on mayoral devolution deals with local authorities in Cornwall, Norfolk, and, intriguingly, what he described as an area in the northeast of England. These deals are expected to happen shortly. And on housing, Hunt revealed plans to cap the increase in social rents at 7% in 2023-24 and 2024-25. The Chancellor said that the government would, meanwhile, change its approach to the new investment zones that have been announced. The government will now use the investment zone programme to catalyse a limited number of the highest potential knowledge-intensive growth clusters, including through leveraging local research strengths. Good news for high streets, as Hunt also announced a £14 billion business rates tax cut over the next 5 years. Nearly 2/3 of properties will not pay a penny more next year, and thousands of pubs, restaurants and small high street shops will benefit, he said. Now, in conclusion, this was a wide-ranging package, as you can see, with welcome new funding, but many controversial aspects. But the question is this: is it enough? And does this properly rebalance the financial situation of local authorities sufficient to provide the future stability that they require?
Well, I can tell our listeners that at the opening address of the second day conference, Mick King, Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, warned that despite whatever sympathies he might have for the difficult circumstances local authorities find themselves in, this fact will not in any way inform the findings of the complaints his office deals with. Indeed, he stated, whilst conscious of the pressures, our conclusion is we must hold the line on the standards we expect. It is not for me to wave away rights. His was a fascinating address, drawing on the history of the Ombudsman and comparing devolved jurisdictions to consider the role of the monitoring officer and maladministration. He was keen to stress that in his view, maladministration was an underused asset for the MO in discharging their valuable role. He expressed understanding of the downgrading of the MO and the lack of status, respect and influence we see, but argued that powers under Section 5 of the Local Government and Housing Act 1989 were a clear lever in exerting influence. He also acknowledged the proximity of illegality to maladministration within Section 5 is not helpful, and reminded us that maladministration should be presented as a distinct and different ability. One of my favourite sound bites from his session was that maladministration was a matter for the corporate centre, not the call centre. Words to be heeded. If you want to hear more about Mick King's address at the conference, take a look at my blog in last week's Bulletin Edition. Now, Dennis, which of the sessions would you like to highlight?
A very difficult choice, Helen, as I could have picked any of them. But I'm always drawn to those cross-cutting topics that are important to all our members. And so I've decided to start with VWV's data protection session, which impressed me a lot. Here's my summary. VWV are one of our popular contributors to LLG conferencing, and here Andrew Galley and Julianne Kirkpatrick cantered with consummate ease through the latest developments in data protection law. The session covered a range of topics of direct interest to our members. They included managing difficult subject access requests, an analysis of information security and data breaches, some guidance on how to respond to complaints, and finally, rounding off with some recent developments, including the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. They also looked at accountability in practice. Now, I found it especially interesting, Helen, how the session looked at the initial consideration of issues when receiving a subject access request, and the importance of identifying a strategic approach. And don't be afraid to seek clarifications. The various exemptions were analysed in detail, and the circumstances when a refusal to respond to requests is considered appropriate. And followers of the LLG Bulletin will be aware of the reports of data breaches involving local authorities and the huge impact that they have. The presenters discussed the work and role of the National Cyber Security Centre and those areas of desktop practices that give rise to the greatest risks of security breaches in local authorities. I don't want to worry members unduly, but the range of consequences of data breaches and data attacks is, well, what can I say, quite frightening. Fines, compensation, public reprimands, personal liability, and public complaints. But the guidance and practices covered in this session would certainly ease your mind. Andrew and Julianne guided us through recommended practices in handling complaints, emphasising the importance of training and maintaining and reviewing your policy frameworks. They rounded off with a summary of the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill and how the UK data law will look post-Brexit. And finally, the speakers had some very interesting observations to make and some novel ideas on the subject of training and how it should be undertaken. Overall, this was a session not to miss, and all members would find the topics discussed here of direct relevance to their work.
Well, I'm going to look at special severance payment guidance next, presented by David Leach and Julie Barn from Sharp Pritchard. I never tire of finding an opportunity to raise the judicial review LLG brought against the government, along with Alice, in respect of the exit payment cap, during which the government revoked the regulations. And as I was chairing the session, well, let's just say I raised the matter again. Anyway, I digress. So here we learnt the drivers for reform, which are: the government thinks that public sector exit arrangements are extremely generous and not comparable to the private sector. Although David told us that the evidence isn't overly supportive of this, not least because, as we know, pension strain is usually the greatest source of these figures. But also that the government's view is that SSP is not value for money on taxpayers' money. So what are special severance payments? Well, they're payments made to employees, office holders, workers, contractors, and others outside of statutory. So what are special severance payments? Well, they are payments made to employees, office holders, workers, contractors, and others outside of statutory, contractual, or other requirements when leaving employment in public service. The circumstances as to when they are likely to arise are, of course, resignation, dismissal, and termination of contract. We then heard about best value considerations for payment, exceptional circumstance, accountability, and disclosure. And David looked at a recent case where sign-off did not follow financial rules or the Constitution. No legal advice was obtained, nor were the 151 officer or MO aware of the agreement, which demonstrated process failings at the upper level. David concluded with the following wise advice. Settlement agreements can still be used to resolve disputes, but any payment made will be subject to very close scrutiny. Robust justification, well-reasoned economic and efficiency and effectiveness grounds is required. It's not to be used just to avoid unwelcome publicity or embarrassment. And employee management and HR issues should be dealt with in accordance with local authority policy procedures. Obtain legal advice on the merits of a claim and review your scheme of delegation, ensuring persons assigned to make such decisions understand the guidelines. So, Dennis, what have you got for us next?
The government plan to integrate health and social care was welcomed by our sector as the right thing to do in principle. But the spotlight soon fell upon the highly controversial details in the proposed legislation, and in particular on the governance implications. So Bevan Britton's session on this was timely and on point. Here's my summary. Just before I begin this summary, Integrated Care hit the news again with a specific announcement in the autumn statement about a new review. The government has asked former Health Secretary Patricia Hewitt to lead an independent review into the oversight of integrated care boards in England and how they can best work with autonomy and accountability. Kurt Powell-Ogill's session was topical and in-depth, beginning with an introduction to the scope of the presentation. She said that she would cover the key provisions of the Health and Care Act 2022, the implications of the introduction of the statutory provisions on joint working. She also took us through the new and emerging governance arrangements between the NHS and local authorities, and what meaningful and effective structures should now look like, examining the key interfaces involved and specifically how the role of local government might change. Kurt Powell covered how local authorities can play their part in full, the need for proactive engagement in the new strategic systems, and active participation in the new arrangements. As practitioners in this field would expect, Kurt Powell illustrated the nature of the two new structures established by the 2022 Act, namely the Integrated Care Boards and the Integrated Care Partnerships. Local authorities, of course, expect a significant influence in these new partnerships, and she explained their role in the new system. Kurt Powell spoke of the importance of best practice up and down the country on collaborative working, and she explained how these structures are expected to work and engage with local authorities, and how more consistency is likely to develop. But she acknowledged some problems. She said some of the legislative guidance was fragmented and unhelpful. Kurt Powell then went on to examine the key features of pre-existing governance interfaces, emphasising the importance of a clear overall strategic approach to joint working. So how will the new strategic governance arrangements actually improve collaboration between local government and the NHS? She said a new common language is emerging and ambitions are better understood. She pointed out the potential, however, for conflicts of interest in the commissioner-provider split and discussed these aspects in the context of the new collaborative arrangements. Kurt Powell next posed the question, but what will really change? Who are the key stakeholders in the new government strategy for commissioning in the new structures? And on governance, commissioning and funding, Kurt Powell took us through options for what is known as a place-based governance and what each will involve for local authorities and how their role might change. She rounded off with an examination of the latest relevant guidance, including the NHS guidance on good governance and collaboration just published in October, and made observations about the future. Changes are needed, she said, to the current statutory framework for the provision of joint working between the NHS and local authorities. Now, this was an enlightening and insightful presentation that governance practitioners and policy development officers would certainly not want to miss on this key area of developing policy.
So my other highlight from the second day is Henry Birmingham and Helen Brown from Waitmans, who spoke on the COVID-19 inquiry. I was particularly interested to learn about the modules, most probably because, as Henry said, they're highly technical and lawyerish. There are three modules so far: preparedness, governance, and impact on healthcare systems. We do not yet know what the next 12 modules will be. However, Module 1 opened on the 21st of July this year, and it's designated to look into the preparedness for the pandemic. It assesses if the pandemic was properly planned for and whether the UK was adequately ready for that eventuality. The module will touch on the whole system of civil emergencies, including resourcing, risk management and pandemic readiness. And it will also scrutinise government decision-making relating to planning and seek to identify lessons that can be learned. Module 2 opened on the 31st of August, and it's split into parts. First, it will look into core political and administrative governance and decision-making for the UK. It will include the initial response, central government decision-making, political and civil service performance, as well as the effectiveness of relationships with governments in the devolved administrations and local and voluntary sectors. Module 2 will also assess decision-making about non-pharmaceutical measures and the factors that contributed to their implementation. And then Module 3 opened recently on the 8th of November, and it's going to look into the governmental and societal response to COVID, as well as dissecting the impact that the pandemic had on healthcare systems, patients, and healthcare workers. And this will include healthcare governance, primary care, NHS backlogs, the effects on healthcare provision by vaccination programs, as well as long COVID diagnosis and support. Henry concluded that the inquiry will be quick and intense and not like other inquiries. So let's see. Now, the LLG team put in an incredible amount of work to produce such a high quality conference, and my thanks to them for all their energy, commitment, and needed sense of humour. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good